I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this episode of the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm Brett. I know you're used to hearing Alice first, and Alice is still not with us today, but you are fortunate because I am not alone. I am joined with Scott Huver, veteran reporter and the author of the hot new true crime book, Beverly Hills, Noir, Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brett. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I'm really excited about this because I got to tell you, my experience with Beverly Hills is limited to the 90s television show. And I didn't realize that it seems like maybe that show was a little bit more accurate than I thought. So
definitely more true to life than the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah. And so I got to ask, how did you stumble upon the fact that Beverly Hills is apparently a place where you're going to find everything from murder suicides to superstars, shoplifters, and rat pack barroom rumbles and everything in between?
Yeah. 30 years ago this year, I moved to Los Angeles, and within a few days of being here, I actually saw the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase with my own two eyes. And that sort of set the stage for where my career was going to go in the next couple of years. And I got a job at a newspaper in Beverly Hills that had been around and was sort of the paper of record, the Beverly Hills Courier, and I juggled a bunch of different beats, one of which was police and crime. And as I got a better rapport with the police department, I started learning about some of the past stories that were exceptional, along with the things that I was covering at the time. And crime in Beverly Hills always seems to have like an unusual flair to it. Not every story, but there's always some juicy, story every few months that's got some only in Beverly Hills kind of twist. So as I looked into the history, I just kept coming up with story after story after story. And I kind of, long after I had left the newspaper and eventually segued into entertainment journalism, I just kind of kept researching the stories that interested me the most. And finally, during the pandemic, I found myself, like all of us, with time on my hands. And
was why this podcast is here.
And I was able to put together a book proposal and shop it around, get an agent, get a publisher, and then finally put these stories, a selection of them. I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of them, but this was sort of my opening salvo of unusual Beverly Hills crime stories.
I got to tell you, I was looking through the book and I flipped back to the front to see whether or not there was a volume 1 in the beginning, because there was so much. It just, as I said, I didn't realize this was such a fertile ground.
And I didn't even have room, real estate to cover something like the Menendez brothers. That's a book in and of itself. Or Bugsy Siegel being killed there. Those have been done and not as fresh as some of the stories in here, but also there's so much to them. There's so many twists and turns to every story that happens in the true crime realm in Beverly Hills. So these were my favorites. I actually overwrote, and I have essentially a second book's worth of stories ready to go. So if people like it, make sure to tell my publisher. But it was really fun to try to figure out which stories I wanted to include here, because I wanted to, everything needed to have the crime happen in Beverly Hills itself, like in the city limits of Beverly Hills. And then I wanted something, something representative from just about every decade. And I wanted a bunch of different kinds of crimes. I didn't want to do murder. Right. I wanted to shake it up and include some stories that might ring a bell if you sort of know local legend, or something like Winona Ryder that I'm sure you've heard of, but do you know all the details? And then stuff like the Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin story that nobody remembers anymore unless you were there when it happened. And then things that only I knew because I covered them at the time, or stories that have just kind of faded into obscurity. So I thought that was going to be a good mix to kind of show this really rich true crime history that Beverly Hills has.
I do like that because too often true crime is just about the murders, but there's some really interesting stories where no one's killed. And I think your book really epitomizes that. So you've been doing true crime since before it was cool. You were doing it. I mean, I guess it's always been cool, but you were doing it as a journalist before, the 24-hour news cycle and podcasts and everything else.
It was just kicking off with, I think the Menendez case really started that big pop cultural slow roll into this true crime fetish that we all seem to have now.
Yeah. And did you cover yourself any of the cases that you talk about in the book?
Yeah. The second to the last chapter in the book is a collection of stories that I covered myself, mostly from the late 90s and early 2000s. And I linked them through the 4 stories that I tell in there. There's a couple tangents I go on, but the 4 main stories I tell are all sort of people pretending to be something that they aren't. Great acting ability is not limited to professional actors in Beverly Hills. And these were, con artists or people using actual literal masquerade type, devices to pull these stories off. So those 4 stories were from my own experience. And then I did cover the story of the final chapter, which is about the Winona Ryder shoplifting trial. And I was in the courtroom pretty much every day of that trial and was lucky that I found all my original notes while I was writing the chapter. So I had some really vivid recollections to kind of stir my memories of that, which was an interesting time.
That's the last chapter in the book, but since you brought it up, that is one that fascinated me just because I remember it. I think a lot of people remember it. And Winona Ryder was sort of the it girl. She's on top of the world. Everybody knows who she is. And all of a sudden she gets busted for shoplifting. Based on your sort of coverage, do you have any insight as to what exactly was going on there?
Yeah, it felt so out of the blue when it happened. And so why, and everybody's assumption at the time was maybe she got a kick out of doing it. It was like a thrill to get away with it. Because certainly she did, while she stole thousands of dollars worth of merchandise, it was nothing she couldn't have afforded. And she spent plenty during that shoplifting spree legitimately, to kind of cover what she was stealing. So it was really why? And so as you look into her background, you start to understand it a little bit more. She came from a very countercultural family, from the Bay Area. Her father was a rare book dealer. Her mother was a teacher and an artist and filmmaker. And they were friends with, Allen Ginsberg, and her godfather is Timothy Leary. So she was raised with a healthy disrespect for authority, right? But then at the time this happened, although she was as hot as she'd ever been in her career, she'd been nominated for 2 Academy Awards, she was having a bit of imposter syndrome and having a tough time coping with believing she deserved the level of fame and success that she had. And then she'd had some romantic failures on top of that. And so emotionally, she was in kind of a, rough place. And then she injured herself while she was making the movie Mr. Deeds with Adam Sandler. And that hurting her elbow led to a prescription pain pill addiction that got to a degree that she was, taking far more than she should have been, shopping doctors and that sort of thing to get extra medication, which was not a thing we really knew about that much back then. Now, certainly we're all familiar with that kind of situation happening to people in our own lives, but that's where she was. And I think that was a perfect storm for her to do something as sort of dangerous and sort of foolish for her own reputation to steal. I think the thing I still don't quite understand is why she fought it in court, because that didn't do her any favors. She could have just done a plea deal. The DAs wanted to win in the wake of celebrity cases like O.J. Simpson. They wanted to be able to say, you can't buy your way out of trouble, but she could have done it a lot more quietly. And I think that the trial really exposed things like the drug addiction that she would rather have not. So I never really quite understood why there was such an attempt, especially with a kind of feeble defense, multiple defenses that didn't add up together, why she did that. But it was certainly fascinating to see her come to court in these amazing designer clothes, many labels that she had actually stolen from Saks Fifth Avenue, and then turn around and create a relationship with some of the designers like Marc Jacobs. who she's now done, fashion campaigns for 20 years after she stole one of his headbands from Saks. So just a fascinating thing. And then weird little sidebars, like a member of the jury was the head of Sony Pictures, who was technically her boss on several movies, but still got placed on the jury. So it was a wild, and that was kind of the plateau of the celebrity crime era that kind of wrapped up with the Lindsay Lohans and the Britney Spears of the world. So it was the beginning of kind of a bad girl era in celebrity true crime.
That case is interesting, and you just sort of put your finger on it. I feel like you must have had to have stolen a lot of stuff for those people to want to press charges against Winona Ryder at that time. You would think they would almost just sort of look the other way. But at some point, I guess it just became so problematic they couldn't do that.
I think there were multiple factors in that. It was brought up in court, but never fully explored that she had been caught and let off more than once in the past, both in Beverly Hills and in New York City. And so she did have a history, but she hadn't been prosecuted before. And then I think it was probably her attorney, Mark Garagos, one of the, more renowned celebrity defense attorneys, who might have stirred the pot a little bit by trying to turn the blame on to Saks Fifth Avenue and say that they wanted a high profile celebrity bust right before the holidays to warn people not to shoplift. And I'm like, that's the last thing Saks Fifth Avenue needed, was that kind of publicity. So I don't know if I would buy that from the jump. But yeah, it became a kind of a war where Saks was like, we're not dropping the charges. Beverly Hills Police is pretty diligent because they're under every microscope simply by being Beverly Hills Police for, people looking for them to make mistakes or to, show some kind of bias or favoritism. So they have to be pretty upright. So they had to follow through. And yeah, it was something else. And at the end of the day, Saks was so tired of the publicity that came out of it all that when she was detained at the store, she said that she was told by a director to shoplift in preparation for a role. And Exactly. She dropped a couple of movies, one of which was Shop Girl, which was based on Steve Martin's novella. And when that movie actually did get made, which has no shoplifting in it, by the way, they lobbied to be the setting for the movie, where in the book it was Neiman Marcus, their big rival. And they successfully became the location that Shop Girl was set in. And Saks Fifth Avenue, Beverly Hills never looked better than it does in that movie.
That's hilarious. So I kind of want to back up for a moment because we've been talking about Beverly Hills as if everybody knows what it is. And I think most people probably have about as much familiarity with it as I do. They saw it on television in the 90s and they've heard of it and they sort of know about the general reputation of it. But what is Beverly Hills? That may sound like a strange question, but what exactly is it?
It's a good question because there's very specific answers to it, that why Beverly Hills has this distinction that it's had for basically the better part of a century and a half. Like, it's a no more than 5 square mile territory. It's its own city, kind of right at the center of Los Angeles, which is a big sprawling geographic area, but it's right at the little hole in the donut of LA. And it was, it spent many years as a Spanish ranchero in the old days. And at the beginning of the 20th century, some landowners purchased it hoping to find oil underneath the ground, and that didn't work out for them. So they're like, what can we do with all this land we own? Beverly Hills was sort of situated in this beautiful canyon area, but halfway between downtown, which was the hub of LA at the time, and the Pacific Ocean, like Santa Monica. And so they decided to build a luxury resort. So people who were traveling to the beach from downtown would have an overnight place to stay, and they were usually people with money. And perhaps they would fall in love with the area because it was so picturesque. And they did. And it became immediately like a wealthy enclave in LA. Just a few years after that, the stars and the movie moguls in Hollywood, the area that is known as Hollywood, were getting fed up that it was becoming so synonymous with scandal and sinful behavior that they wanted to be more upper crusty. And people like Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin moved to Beverly Hills to have more privacy, to be more remote, to be more out of the way of prying eyes. So whatever scandal they did want to have, they could do it very quietly. And the movie moguls followed suit. And then captains of industry of all kinds of, big companies and, politicians and regents from other nations, like they all started to put down roots in Beverly Hills very early. And it stayed that way. And it became, synonymous with the celebrity hometown. Will Rogers, who was a famous humorist in his day, popularized it across the country by using it as the dateline in his newspaper columns, like in talking about his Beverly Hills neighbors, like very folksy, but they were all rich and famous people. And then it perpetuated with things like the Beverly Hillbillies and Beverly Hills Cop. And, Rodeo Drive took off in the early 70s as a global capital of fashion and designer labels and really, really expensive, ridiculous toys. And then the plastic surgery industry followed suit. So it's been right at the heart of Hollywood throughout all of this. And it has stayed pretty much the same all these years. And the only thing that's different, when I came to Beverly Hills, you did still see, and I write about it in the book, like, in everyday situations, you would see a lot of celebrities. I saw Jack Lemmon at city council complaining about something his neighbor wanted to do. I saw Valerie Harper at the school board, because her kid was going to the public school there. And different celebrities would call me on the phone to weigh in on like local issues. And that, you go out to any restaurant, there were certain restaurants you could know you were going to go out to see Dean Martin having dinner. And that small town where you could see the celebrities just going about their business, that has sort of gradually faded. You can still spot them, but you don't see them just wandering around Rodeo Drive like you used to, unless they want the attention, which sometimes they do. But the advent of the cell phone and TMZ and all of that has kind of put a damper on how public the celebrities are when they're out and about in Beverly Hills, as opposed to like 30 years ago when I got there.
I always did wonder if sort of it becoming a tourist destination. When I went to Los Angeles for the first time, we went to Beverly Hills and drove down through the palm trees and everything, which I imagine everybody does. And I always wondered if that would actually turn off those people, that they would sort of go find a different enclave to move to, and if Beverly Hills would kind of fall out of style. But it seems like maybe it's gotten a little bit more, they've gone underground a little bit more, but it still is an elite place to live.
Yeah, plenty of celebrities still live there. Plenty of people in the industry at the top levels live there. Places like Bel Air and Holmby Hills have sort of eclipsed, they're like, if you're even richer than the usual Beverly Hills resident, you go there. They don't have their own police force or city structure, though. They're just neighborhoods of LA. And then Malibu, for the uber rich, has become, and the Pacific Palisades, that's become their sort of hangout. But Beverly Hills still has a lot of that, star power and a lot of very, very wealthy residents still today. It's wild. Given how big LA is, you would think other spots would really come up. But even the ones I just mentioned are all very traditional. But the tourism thing has always been an interesting push-pull. The city of Beverly Hills loves all the tourism dollars that pour in, but they have to keep a tight leash on how far they go in enabling tourists, because the residents will push back and push back hard, because sometimes they have as much money as the entire city does. So it's always been kind of a push-pull. But at one point during the 90s, Beverly Hills was, in Southern California, it was number 2 tourist attraction, second to Disneyland and maybe the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. It was that popular. Some of the fun luster of of Rodeo Drive has gone away, because a lot of what I laughingly would say mom and pop stores that were on Rodeo Drive, the boutiques that specialized in the showmanship that made it famous, all basically sold their properties to big corporate designer labels that you can get in every other city. So now it's just sort of the novelty of walking down Rodeo Drive, but you're seeing the same brands that you can see just about anywhere these days.
It's funny, the same problems that everywhere else has. Yeah. Beverly Hills sees as well. And I think that's reflected in your book. We were talking about Winona Ryder. I think one thing your book shows is it doesn't matter how famous you are or how much money you have. You still have the same sort of petty problems as anybody else and crimes as anybody else. It's just when it happens in Beverly Hills, it tends to be a little bit more exciting and extravagant. And I don't want to give the whole book away, but I did the introduction about Alfred Hitchcock. Why don't you tell people that story?
It's
Hook them and bring them in.
it's so it's such a fun story, and it's one that I honestly like tripped over doing research for the other stories. Like I'd never heard of it before, and I've got half a dozen or more volumes about Alfred Hitchcock here at home, and I'd never seen that story, but I found it in newspapers.com or wherever, like doing my research, and it's so fun. And I'll try not to be too spoilery about it, but Hitchcock had a press luncheon at the Brown Derby in Beverly Hills, one of the very famous Brown Derby chain. The more quiet, upscale one was in Beverly Hills, right at the corner of Rodeo Drive and Wilshire Boulevard. Before Rodeo Drive was what it is today, it was mostly restaurants back then. And he had this press luncheon for the second season of his television show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And in the middle of the luncheon, two Beverly Hills police officers walk in and tell Hitchcock that he's under arrest. And everybody is aghast, like, what is happening? And they take him out and they throw him in the paddy wagon. And then they turn to all the guests and they say, yeah, you're coming to headquarters too. We are going to need to talk to all of you. And they show up and there's Hitchcock getting fingerprinted. The chief of police is there kind of, talking down to him, and they look around and all of a sudden they see wanted posters with their own faces on it. And as it turned out, it wasn't quite what it seemed at the time. Hitchcock had a very, very keen sense of the practical joke. But the lesson in it is exactly what you said, is it's like when something happens in Beverly Hills, you're not expecting it. You're on top of the world. Even if you're just a reporter going to cover a press luncheon, like, your life's pretty good. My life's pretty good when I do stuff like that. And all of a sudden, here come the cops, and you're thinking, wait, what do they think I did? Or worse, what did they find out that I did actually do? And my kind of buzzword about this is, about Beverly Hills is like, when you have it all, you have everything to lose.
Right. And I think, I feel like true crime lately, maybe it's reflecting society and people's just general mood. It's gotten really dark. It feels like all the true crime books that come out these days are very dark. They're very heavy subjects. But your book is a lot of fun. I mean, it's obvious it's about crime. There's some murders in there, not all of them, but your book has a lot of fun. I think people are really going to enjoy walking through it. And I'm not going to call it a guilty pleasure, but if you like true crime, it's true crime that you can enjoy without feeling depressed when you close the book. Yeah. Is that something that you tried to do?
Very much on purpose. I mean, there are some dark stories, to tell. And in this book, probably the darkest is the hostage situation that took place on Rodeo Drive in the 80s. That's a pretty dark tale and full of tension and drama. And the opening story, the first murder in Beverly Hills in 1929, is a little dark, but there's something about the ostentatious nature of the setting. Beverly Hills is the consistent character in every story, and everything's a little over the top, and everything's, a degree or two separation from Hollywood. Somebody famous people are walking on, walking off. Sometimes they're the culprit. Sometimes they're the victim. Sometimes they're a witness. It's just a weird and woolly kind of landscape. And I loved that. And I didn't want to spend, a ton of time in my own life researching these dark, depressing stories. I wanted to have fun with it. And so something like the second chapter in the book is the story of Gerard Graham Dennis, the cat burglar from the 1940s, who is an extraordinary character. Like, if you saw a movie about him, you wouldn't believe it. The stuff that the guy gets away with, because he's so good looking and charming, but also really smart when it comes to being a professional thief. And his story is so wild. It took me years to get it all together and find out what all happened to him. And that was so much fun. You're almost rooting for him by the end of it. You're like, he's so good. You're like, yes, get away from them one more time. And then with the celebrities, I'm a huge Rat Pack fan. I'm very much, all about Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin. And so that story, I wanted to tell, it's a crazy story. It has some tension. It has some scary moments, but I also wanted to pay tribute to that friendship that they had and that sense of play and fun as an adult. And it just took a wrong turn one night and everybody was chewing their fingernails, worried about what the outcome was going to be. But it ultimately turned out to be okay. Plus, there was a great mystery at the center of it that I didn't get solved until I was almost finished writing the book. So that was kind of fun. But yeah, I liked the diversity. And I felt like if you're talking about crime in Beverly Hills, it should be kind of fun to read about.
I like how you named all the chapters after movies too. There's a subtle little thing, but I like that. Well, Scott, the book's great. I think people are going to love it. I'm glad that we've had you on to talk about it, but I can't let you go without changing subjects ever so slightly, if you will indulge me.
Yeah.
So, on our other podcast, The Prosecutors, we just recently covered another celebrity crime that is dark, the death of Natalie Wood. And I know you've done a lot in that area. So I just have to ask you, what insights can you offer about that case? The listeners are all very familiar with it, the circumstances, what happened. Well, not exactly what happened on the boat, because that's the mystery. But what are your thoughts on that case?
It's such a fascinating case because there is this big black hole of information right at the center of it. And I don't know if we're, unless somebody finally is willing to talk, I don't know if we're ever going to get the truth, or a version of the truth. So from my experience with researching the case, talking about the case on a podcast, like, I think that clearly something happened that Robert Wagner felt the need to cover up. What was it that he had killed his wife? I'm not so convinced about that, but I feel that in the moment he panicked at the very least and had had things kind of massaged so they didn't look quite as bad for him. And the captain of the yacht that was his employee has pretty much, said that he was instructed and paid to do things a certain way because that's what his boss wanted him to do. Did he kill her? I'm not there yet, but he is also, whether he realized it or not, has admitted to having kind of a very jealous and violent streak in him. In his own memoir, when Natalie was dating Warren Beatty, he described an incident in which he was essentially lying in wait outside Warren Beatty's house with a gun, and he didn't do anything. But that's a pretty huge admission to make when you've been scrutinized for the death of your wife for many decades. And I'm like, you not realizing that you're confessing this dark side of yourself that now people are going to jump on? And still people didn't make as big a deal of that as I thought when I read it. And I've met Robert Wagner. He's a very, gentlemanly person if you encounter him. And I know people that adore him. And his stepdaughter did an entire film to try to wash this stuff away, but it still wasn't super effective. And the LAPD has the case still open. They haven't in the last few years, like, they made a big deal of maybe 5-6 years ago about keeping it open. They haven't said that they've closed it or that they're dropping it. Like, no new information, good or bad, has come out of it. So it's still this really perplexing thing. That's what I have on it.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people, he has sort of a dark streak. I mean, we talk about Beverly Hills, we talk about, it's so glitzy, it's so glamorous, it's so perfect. But if you look deep, if you spend enough time there, you're going to find the dark side. And I kind of feel like it seems like he has that too. And I agree with you. One thing that we said in the case is, whether you believe he murdered her or not, it is clear to me that she died because of something that happened on that boat. Yes. Now, maybe it was they got in such a terrible fight that she got in that dinghy to get away and an accident happened. But I think he does blame himself for it because something led to that. And there's no question that everyone on the boat, it seems like to me, I mean, no question is too strong, I don't want to get sued, but it seems like everybody on the boat, initially at least, lied about it. They lied about, just an ordinary night, nothing happened. Well, that's not true. We know now there was this massive fight. Yeah. So they were covering something up.
And the massive, alcohol consumption when they were ashore in Catalina, and all that booze and the combination of a sort of already volatile relationship between Natalie and RJ, and then Christopher Walken's presence, who, he was, I don't think anybody's gone as far as to say that they were having an affair with any sort of proof, but she was definitely had her head turned by Walken because he was such an admirer of hers and was encouraging her to, like, do bigger things in her career, and that triangular friction at alcohol, and that can be a really volatile situation. So, I'm surprised Walken hasn't finally, just for once and for all, come out and said, okay, here is what happened, just so that people would stop speculating. But he's another very unusual character. So
yeah, that is true.
A few times, and he is a very unusual character.
Well, Scott, I've really enjoyed this. I said I would respect your time, so I don't want to keep you here all night. But, you're welcome to come on the show anytime and talk about this stuff. You're a natural storyteller, and it comes through in the book, and I hope people will pick it up. I assume the book is available wherever one gets books.
Pretty much everywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstores can get it for you if they don't have it in stock.
And do you know when that's coming out? I just asked because it's a podcast. A lot of our listeners really like listening to their books.
Oh, yeah. It'll be out on this December 31st.
Okay, awesome.
Just in a few weeks, right after Christmas. So if you got your gift cards,
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. And the physical book, if you still like reading physical books, or if you want to read it on Kindle, is available now. So stocking stuffers and Christmas gifts for everybody. Probably by the time you guys hear this, it'll be after Christmas. So for all those people you forgot to buy gifts for, you need to stock up on this book. Well, guys, you need to check it out. Beverly Hills Noir by Scott Huver. Crime, Sin, and Scandal in 90210. You can't get any better than that. Well, sir, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll join us some other time. And thank you for taking the time to write the book. It is excellent. Okay, guys, if you read the book and you enjoy it, I hope you'll let us know. Those of you in the book club, I hope this is one y'all will pick up. I can't wait to hear what you think. Let us know, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, and we will see you guys on the gallery to discuss this. Well, that's all we have for today, but we will be back next week. But until then, I'm Brett, and this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. And obviously, this isn't live, so, if you say something, you're like, man, I shouldn't have said that. We'll just stop. Just, cut that out and keep going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll try to be discreet.
Is it Hoover?
Yes, it is.
Scott Huver. Okay. All right, here we go. Is there an audiobook?
The audiobook comes out December 31st.
Are you reading it or someone else reading it?
Somebody else, and forgive me, the actor, he's a big name in the audiobook world, and I got a sample of actors to choose from, and he was by head and shoulders the best one, and I'm sorry.